Hi guys. So welcome back to our second episode on my TED Talk last semester.
Mhm.
The TED Talk had the theme of legacy, what we hope to leave behind, and the topic I chose to center my topic around was the rules-based world order. So in our last episode, we talked about my TED Talk up until the point. We talked about my TED Talk and covered its past and present, and now we're going to talk about how we can leave a better world order behind, which was the
Mhm.
only reason I could actually use this topic in my speech. The sad thing is, I don't really know how to leave better world order behind, so this part of the speech wasn't very insightful and interesting, to be honest. But yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Okay. So let's play the TED Talk.
Now, the current world order will still limp on for a few more years, a decade, or two, or three. But whenever the time comes to renovate it, we will be there. In the next few years, we'll be the youth, the students. A few years after that, we'll be the working force. And a few more years after that, we may be in charge. But when the time comes, we'll be here. If we leave a better world order behind, we might be remembered as the generation that stood up when times were tough. Now, I could end here. And honestly, I think that all of us would probably leave with a slightly better understanding of the world order. At least that's what I hope. But no, I've also tried to give some of my opinions on how we can improve the world order. Now, of course, as a high school student, I don't have any of the answers. I don't have the remedies for the international society or the world order, but I would like to share a few ideas that I have. Firstly,
So this part. So what are you trying to establishing by this part that you are pretending to end, but you actually did not?
oh yeah, the pretending to end part is an idea that I had at the very start of my speech. So I thought it would be cool to do this because I've seen a few TED Talks that have done this, and
Hmm.
I thought it would be a good idea. Um, it would slightly lighten the mood and make my TED Talk, which is slightly academic, less boring.
Hmm.
Needless to say, I didn't really achieve that because obviously, um, it needs to be delivered in a better way. And I could have probably delivered it better, but I wasn't really feeling confident up to this point because I had I had again forgotten most of my scripts after like three
Oh, that's
paragraphs or
bad.
something. Yeah, so it I wasn't as confident as I could be at this point, so the delivery wasn't great either. So the feigning ending part, it didn't work out that well either. Actually, now I listened to it, it sounded kind of pretentious, but yeah. Anyway, the main goal of this part was to transition from the theory that we talked about last
Hmm.
podcast to what we should do, how we leave a better world order behind. And what I tried to do first was establish that the fact that the audience, which was mostly high school students, will be there when the world order does eventually change into the next one, whether that's right now or a few more years or a few decades in the future. And I and I don't think that's pure rhetorical. Yeah, I don't think that's just a pure rhetorical move to engage the audience. I think that is honestly true because when you think about it, like for example, the current order, it's not going to exist for that much longer. Changes are going to have to be made, I
Yeah.
think. So, and I think, we probably will be there maybe in our early 20s, 30s, or 40s. But yeah, so I don't think it was purely rhetorical. I think that part did kind of still make sense, even though its goal was very rhetorical, and that is to progress the speech and move on to the next part.
So yeah, I do think that this somehow like transition from the theory part, but to the like what you have to do or like the proposal part. But I would say that in terms of the speech, like the I don't think every audience could catch that because it was like some of the audience might not be really that engaged and people might be confused about what's going on. But anyways, like would you mind to like sum up like the theory, what were the main thesis of the theory again in this episode, in case some might miss the previous one?
Oh, that's quite difficult academically, and that I'm a little sleepy, so I might not do such a good job. But
Mhm.
anyway, basically, what I talked about in the first part of my speech was the uh was the rules-based world order, its past and its present. Present is slightly easier. I don't think it's in a good shape because primarily because of what has happened recently. And I think basically what has happened recently is the world is more transactional than before, and a very important thing, which is the veneer that the hypocrisy of the system created the veneer of rules and principles. It has taken a blow because of recent acts where strong powers or leading powers no longer even try to justify their actions through morals and moral high ground, but rather frame it in very transactional ways. Um, okay, that probably wasn't the best place to start um,
Mhm.
with this overview, but basically the theory that I talked about last episode was how the world-based rule order came about, and my understanding is that it came about because world leaders, after seeing the destruction of the First World War and also the Second World War, leaders around the world recognized the need to prevent this from happening in the future. In fact, I was just reading the preamble of the United Nations Charter today, and its first sentence says, "We the people of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind." So I think, yeah, it's quite obvious that they tried to set up this order. Um, at least, the reason that was, sold to the public was to uh, prevent war and make sure that humanity could progress and develop in a safe and orderly fashion.
Mhm.
I think looking at it from a realist standpoint, the explanation for this is that the international society is an anarchy, and um, you know, many of our other levels of society and organization, for example, at home, at school, and in society, all of these levels of organization, they have rules. So it follows that perhaps, the international society should also have rules instead of acting as an anarchy, where the strong do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. So that's, I think, the realist theory and justification behind the world order. And it's my view that the world order has done quite a decent job in inducing development and prosperity
Mhm.
over the past many years. But it also has flaws, and one well-cited flaw is its double standards or hypocrisy. Basically, many question whether great powers truly act by the principles they set out, and whether international law is enforced uniformly upon all. And the answer is often no. But in a very interesting way, I found this hypocrisy and the veneer of principle and moral high ground that this hypocrisy creates is what sustains the order, because this moral high ground, it gives um, it gives it made, I think, for the first time in history, great power behavior answerable to something more than raw power, and I think this made the system uh, a very powerful system because it created an order that weaker countries could consent to support and participate in
Mhm.
willingly because of the high moral high ground that legitimized this order. Yeah. So that was a
Mhm.
very poor summary, but yeah, that's basically the main gist behind the theory.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. So I
Yeah.
kind of have a question here. So
Oh
we
no.
kind of discussed about like how like the rules-based world order is like disrupting and dismantling itself in the recent years. Well, I haven't been follow like international development for long, maybe for only a couple of years, one or two or so. Yeah. So like, do you think like when did like the international the world order began to collapse? Like, was it the Bush or was it like Russians' war with Ukraine, or was it like Trump's first or Trump's second? So what do you think?
Um, yeah, I think all of the things that you mentioned have contributed to the demise or the gradual demise of the rules-based world order. I think certainly the war on Iraq was the second war on Iraq led by George Bush was it certainly hurt the order
Mm-hmm.
um, because it showed that the system could be manipulated by stronger powers to do what they wanted, even if there was no real reason for it. They could come up with a reason and say that they had weapons of mass destruction and just invade Iraq, which was against international law. Yeah, perhaps Saddam Hussein wasn't the best person, but still, I mean, there wasn't really much justification to invade Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And it did go against international law in many ways. It didn't respect Iraq's territorial integrity and sovereignty and all that. So I think that certainly hurt the credibility of the rules-based world order, and it enhanced the criticisms of hypocrisy and the double standards that many people have been talking about. In terms of the world order. I think the war in Ukraine. Um, I think that actually, to an extent, strengthened the order because,
Why I'm
yes,
interested to hear.
yeah, I mean, of course, it hurt the order in the sense that international law was violated again. But I mean, because the response was also very strong from Western countries, which are, the main proponents of the liberal rules-based world order.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the response was very strong, and the response was cited. It was grounded in international law and in extension the rules-based world order. Because why why the war was wrong is because they cited territorial integrity and sovereignty, all concepts coming from the international law. That is a very important
Mm-hmm.
part of the rules-based world order. Um, so I think yeah, of course, international law was violated, but at the same time, um, the Western countries really showed their resolve, I would say, in this scenario in protecting international law. Now, of course, you could say it's because, it was in line with their own interests. That's perhaps true, but still, um, they acted in defense of international law. I
Mm-hmm.
think why I think that the destruction or the damage dealt on international law has been particularly prominent in recent years is because it's the first time leaders of the international leaders, traditional leaders of the international rules-based world order, basically leading Western countries, have really upended the order. Because even, for example, in the past, with Bush's war in Iraq, they still tried to play um, according to the rules. They came up with
Mm-hmm.
an excuse that was in line with international law that as to explain why they would invade Iraq, and they also went through the various processes necessary to make their invasion legal in terms of international law. They went through the UN Security Council. Um, so in the past, yes, technically, of course, obviously, they it was against international law, but they still went through the processes, and they still upheld, or at least they claimed to uphold the various moral principles that are in the rules-based world order. But this time around, for example, the current administration, um, they make it very clear that, for example, they want control over Venezuela because of its oil resources, and also they want to annex close allies. That's just something that's unheard of, and yeah, I think so. The leading countries upending the world order themselves is something that's never been seen before, and that has, to a very great extent, hurt the credibility of the rules-based world order. Also, for example, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, in his speech in Davos earlier this year,
Mm-hmm.
he also made it very clear that there is hypocrisy in the world system, and that's something that no leading Western leader has ever said before, at least when they were in office and in public, and at such an important meeting such as Davos. So I think what's striking about the damage that's being dealt in recent years to the world order is that it is being led by the leading powers and historically the greatest supporters of the world order, and that has dealt a incredibly large blow to its credibility. Mm.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I totally agree with you. Yeah, so essentially like what you're saying is that like maybe the rules-based international order was kind of like a hypocrisy. Yeah, and I think this also ties into what you said in your TED talk that maybe the Western countries do not want to abide them like for all of the cases, and maybe like there is double standard, but what ultimately like failed the system is what we have been seeing like in the recent years in Trump's second administration, perhaps. Like for example, maybe like there was like the invasion of Crimea in I think it was 2014, and there was also the Ukraine, and there was also like disputes like in the Southern China Sea, that all of which did not exactly go as what the international institutions are kind of wishing for, or what the kind of like the international institutions are kind of like hoping for. But like the Western interests at that moment align with the international law, so it gets to be upheld. But well, when in the recent years, when those two no longer align, the Western leaders no longer like pretend to be upholding the so-called order, but instead just kind of like abandons it, or kind of like humiliates it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what this administration is doing. I think a few days ago, Secretary Rubio uh he put out a statement. He put out a statement basically saying that he wanted to that this administration and the State Department would dismantle the international, I think it was the International Criminal Court. I'm not so sure about the ICC and the ICJ, but anyway, I think it was the International Criminal Court. And I think I listened to his brief, like 2 minute statement or so, and in it he said uh, a phrase really, I think I remember is he called international law so-called international law, which I think is to an extent delegitimizing it. So yeah, I think the stance of this administration is pretty clear. They don't really care much about international law, even though international law was written and mostly supported by, their predecessors and all that.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Maybe Rubio wasn't that like imperialistic or somehow hegemonic. I think before Trump, right? But anyways,
Yeah, I mean Rubio. Yeah, I think he's a decent politician. I think that's true. Certainly very able. I mean, otherwise it's very difficult to reach such high levels of office as the offspring of Cuban immigrants, right? It
true.
must have been very tough for him to get to such high places. So, I mean, I'm certainly sure he's very able.
Yeah, so I think it will be kind of like interesting to see like what policy like he will propose or like upheld after Trump is perhaps leaving office or gone. Yeah, so let's move on. Let's move on to your proposals and suggestions.
On the role of international institutions, like the ones shown here. Now, international institutions obviously have been a very important part and very new, a very important part of the current order that we have. However, I do think that there needs to be some changing in their roles that they play in the future. As much as all of us would like these international organizations to act as comprehensive enforcers of laws and principles that are in the best interest of the world, that simply is very difficult to achieve on the international stage, because no single entity has the monopoly of power or the monopoly on the legal and legitimate use of power that is needed to enforce these rules. I think that international organizations need to see this phenomenon and pivot accordingly. They need to act so that they can bring true value to the table, acting as facilitators rather than regulators, as many international organizations do in the world today. They need to be able to facilitate security, trade, dialogue, education, instead of enacting and enforcing, sometimes occasionally, rules that, and here I quote, apply with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. Instead of doing that, instead of enforcing an unfair system, they need to be able to bring real contributions to the table. And so I think they should pivot toward a facilitator of many important things, among them dialogue, as opposed to being mere regulators or merely existing. The second point.
So let's stop here. So I think the point you are trying to establish here is that because it is impossible for international institutions to really enforce law, because as we've also discussed in the previous episode, because of the lack of monopoly of power. So it will be wiser, and in this way, it could bring like more the so-called true value to the table by being facilitators of the different countries or perhaps disputes. So is that what you're arguing here?
Yeah, basically it's that. Yeah, that's basically the point that, international organizations, the only thing they can do effectively, I think, is facilitate in circumstances when um, cooperation is really in the interests, or whatever the certain organization is championing is really in the interests of individual countries. Because otherwise, I don't think many countries will cooperate, and
Mm-hmm.
international organizations, they can't force them to cooperate.
Uh, so what you're meaning is that that like perhaps international organizations such as the UN or whatever, maybe the WTO should be like Qatar or Switzerland, in terms of diplomatic and economic like affairs.
Um, I'm not so sure about that comparison, but what I basically mean is that, um, like the UN, like for example, I personally think one thing, a very successful example of international cooperation in the
Uh-huh.
past 10 years or so was the Paris Accords. Now, the Paris Accords, they aren't being enforced right now, but the fact that so many countries, around 190, I think, countries and regions, they came together, they discussed it very seriously. Countries sent high-level envoys, and in the end, they came up with an international agreement that was, really, I think, applauded worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
That shows the power of the United Nations. If there wasn't such an organization, I doubt that such a agreement on such a high level, at such a high level would be achieved, frankly. Um, you know, the UN has been a champion of climate change, and I think that certainly contributed to the Paris Accords. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and in that scenario, what the UN did was it was basically a facilitator. It um, continued it championed the issue. It um, invited countries to come and discuss the things that they discuss climate change, and in the end, at least in the negotiating part, it worked. Right, they came up with a very
Mm-hmm.
comprehensive agreement. Um, so like facilitate when like in that regard, it works. Also, for example, when the WTO or other trade organizations, when they facilitate free trade, that has worked generally. Um, but like when the WTO tries to enforce trade rules, that just doesn't work very well. When the UN tries to enforce countries to reach their actual goals in the Paris Agreement, that hasn't worked very well either.
Yeah.
So now that I think now that I say it out loud, it makes it seem that international organizations can't achieve anything, and perhaps that might be true. Um, but I mean, what is also true certainly is that when international organizations are facilitators, when they champion causes that are truly beneficial to countries, countries do tend to come about and cooperate, and I think that's when international organizations function at their best.
Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of still like confused in a way, like if they are like facilitator rather than enforcer, they do not enforce like what is actually on the table. So like as you mentioned for the example of Paris Accord, yes, it is an ambitious piece of climate legislation or memorandum, but as you said, the items are not being enforced. Like humanity is failing the objective of whatever I think is 1.5 degrees set up by the Paris Climate Accord. If in that case, if we cannot carry out what we have achieved in those negotiations, then what is the point of having uh those like deals in the first place? Well, I do believe that maybe like countries discussing things and maybe like exchanging their opinions could lead to like at least it would not be detrimental, right? But at last, if the legislation doesn't work, like I think it is still like questionable.
Yeah, so firstly, I think again, the Paris Accords, it was just, I think, an example of, how successful these international organizations can be as facilitators. Now, of course, I think that can also be brought onto other things where, maybe enforcement is easier and, real contributions or real successes can really be brought about. But yeah, I think in general, it's just really an example of what international organizations can be, at how successful they can be as facilitators. I mean, at least much more successful than they are as enforcers. Where we go from there, it is of course true that they need to be better enforcers, and that is also another question and another problem that the order needs to solve. But yeah, I think in general that was really just an example of how they can be effective facilitators, and I think that's certainly a path to go toward in the future. Secondly, on if they can't enforce, what's the use of all of this? I think it's also very it's also useful to an extent because the fact that climate change was debated in the Paris Accords on such an international level and with such high-level envoys and high-level government officials, I think it I think it really does bring attention and bring awareness to the issue, while also planting it in the subconscious of people around the world as an important one. A parallel example would be um, the concept of self-determination uh, in the early in the mid 20th century, like 1950s, 1960s. It was a concept that was debated at the time, and it was also written into international law, like has climate change and important agreements such as the Paris Accords. It was also written into the UN Charter, and at that time, very little progress was made at first. It was just a concept, but no action was taken. But gradually, because it was written into the UN Charter, it was legitimized, and it was again planted in the subconscious of people around the world, especially colonized people around the world, and gradually, progress was made from there, using this concept that was written into the to the UN Charter at the time. So yeah, I mean, now is it likely that uh, the Paris Accords will bring such impact in the near future? I don't think so because, I mean, it's already been 10 years since, and it hasn't. And I guess traction it has really been dwindling in terms of the Paris Accords. But yeah, I think in general, all these international agreements that are somewhat progressive, they may not be acted upon immediately, but it is still important to have them and to have these agreements on the international stage for the future.
Yeah, yeah, I certainly agree.
Mm.
I do think like in terms of like conferences in terms of climate change, uh they might not like achieve a lot, but I do think there is like gradual improvements throughout the time, right?
Mm.
We have those
Yeah.
like COP meetings every year. Although a lot of times it has been held in oil producing countries, which I think is kind of
Yeah.
an irony, but I think there are at least like new schemes being discussed, although most of the time they will not materialize for a long time or perhaps forever. But I still think that is certainly a positive thing, like to kind of level the ground for everyone. But I do have kind of an argument. I think what you're trying to do here is that I think like enforcer inherently also means that those international institutions have to be facilitators. Like facilitators kind of a subset of enforce a subset of perhaps duty or something, because in order to enforce something you have to facilitate the the negotiation and stuff. So I'm wondering here is that isn't such a transition just kind of something like if I do less things, then probably less things will be wrong. This kind of mindset and this kind of logic.
Yeah, so basically, I do think you make a good point, obviously. And I think it is certainly a conundrum that these international organizations are in. Um, yeah, so I mean, my solution obviously wasn't that great, but why I wanted to include them in to this TED talk was that because, for me, international organizations are such an obvious and glaring issue with the system right now. They just aren't doing what they're supposed to do, and there's no easy remedy for it.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, but I would have to say like I do see an argument where like you would argue that those international institutions will have to be like less ambitious in creating perhaps lofty regulations or goals, and instead to be more pragmatic and like to facilitate conversations that perhaps will indeed bring some sort of value, like to both of the participants and makes such agreement like perhaps mutually beneficial, so that the states are like willing to carry them out. Mhm. Probably we should move on.
Mm.
Okay.
I wanted to make is youth empowerment. Now, I know this sounds like a very cliche topic, and it wasn't the idea I was going for at first, but somehow it's the idea that I came to in the end. I wanted to make two main points initially. The first one is on the importance of making gradual issues known to the world, or reminding the world of the importance of gradual issues. Now, in our context, that would be climate change. Now, gradual issues, especially climate change, they are important because they are, in many cases, still existential crises. For example, climate change. But they are also one of the most dangerous type of existential crises because they are gradual. After the initial ardor, they get put back, and especially when times are tough economically, like right now. Yet, and again, I would like to remind you, and even though I don't really like talking about climate change, it is still a pretty big threat to humanity. And honestly, it makes me feel like we are perhaps the metaphorical boiling frog. Not only metaphorical, actually, but also, perhaps in some cases, literally. And a reason for this, as well as the lack of importance that we apply to many gradual issues, is, apart from ignorance occasionally, is also structural. Because quite simply, the people who are making policies and decisions today will most likely not be the ones who live with the consequences of them tomorrow. Thus, it makes sense that the future or the younger generation of each generation gets to have some say in these matters. In our case, that would be in a matter of climate change. In our case, that would be us. The second point I wanted to make.
Yeah. I kind of want to stop here because this is really a long point. So you mentioned that many graduate issues are indeed quite important, and it is important for us to remind the youth or the voters of those graduate issues. For example, climate change, which is existential. Um, so you mentioned that there is a structural like kind of problem that's impeding us to solve this gradual, or I would say long-term problems, because the leaders do not have to suffer the consequences. So what are your suggestions for changing that? As in the speech or
Yeah, I feel like a PHHS Cup contestant
Mhm.
were in my interview because this is how I interviewed them. I basically go through each sentence and ask them a question. And I'm not doing very well, I must say. Um, yeah, this part of the speech it wasn't that well delivered, as you can probably see, because again, I was like, I had a few ideas, a few sentences in my mind, and the rest of it was pretty much impromptu. The idea of the structural idea was certainly in my script, and it wasn't really the best idea. The idea I originally came to was centered on climate change, um, and the danger that it because that arises because it is a gradual issue. And I personally really do like the boiling frog metaphor that I made here because I think it is both metaphorically and literally
Hmm.
correct.
Hmm.
Um, and this was supposed to be my only point, but then I had another point I wanted to make, but I wanted to only make 3 points. So I had to merge this point and the next point, and somehow they all came under the umbrella of empowering the youth. The structural point in solving climate change wasn't a point that I initially had. It was a point that I forget which AI, but a certain AI gave to me. Um,
Okay.
so I do not take responsibility for it if it's terrible. But I used it in my speech because I think there is some sense to it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
the problem is, I think, even for the youth, even for like you and me, we're not that worried about the consequences of climate change either. I
Yeah.
don't think,
Yeah,
at
yeah,
least
I do
not
see
that.
that.
Yeah, even though we are technically the ones who are going to be living the consequences of it in the next, I don't know, in the next, how many years. Um, how to solve this? Well, I mean, the answer to this question that this point was trying to give is through youth empowerment. Um, how youth are empowered? Um, yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, I think still it starts through advocacy because
Hmm.
I don't think it's a very acceptable idea to give youth real power in like legislatures. Um, so I think it still starts with advocacy. Um, but we still have, we already have quite a fair amount of advocacy in our world already, and they don't seem to be that successful.
Yeah.
Um, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I honestly, do have trouble coming up with, real actionable and effective methods through which, we can really increase youth advocacy and make it helpful toward climate change. I mean, because if I had those points, I would have added them in the speech.
Hmm.
It was intentionally vague to a certain degree.
Yeah, I get it. So what you're saying that use advocacy, but I think it's kind of mismatched, because I think the structural problem you're pointing out is that those who legislate do not have to bear the consequence, and use advocacy does not directly address that, is it? Or does it?
Yeah, well, I think advocacy always helps to an
Advocacy is
extent.
always definitely.
Yeah, but like directly, probably not. I think directly what would help is, the constituents really taking climate change as a very serious issue.
Yeah,
And, only, if you address climate change, would you get the votes. Actually, um, yeah, but like, for example, in the greatest emitters, that's not really happening because while, the weather is getting hotter and perhaps there are slightly more extreme weather events. I don't think climate change is really affecting most of the people in, um, you know, the United States, China, Europe in a existential matter. Yes, I mean, for example, it's very hot, and
I
that's
think
obviously
this is a very privileged quote
yes,
because we have
yes,
air cons and all the stuff, and
yeah, yes, but still, I mean, it's not like that existential as the people in the Pacific, for example, are
mhm,
experiencing.
yeah.
For example, Kiribati and Tuvalu, they may not have, their countries anymore. Now, if
Mhm.
that level of existential crisis was experienced by, leading powers around the world, I'm sure climate change would be at the central of everyone's concerns. But because, again, we aren't experiencing that so intimately, um, the awareness just it won't reach the heights necessary or the levels necessary for there to be real and a great amount of action on climate change, which I think is necessary um, for any progress to be made. For example, the 1.5 Celsius goal, which I think can't be made anymore. I'm not sure.
It's not like realistically achievable.
Yeah, not achievable anymore.
I think is probably earlier this year. So
Mm,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So I actually heard quite an interesting argument about like climate change. It may be a bit I would say off topic from the speech, but it's still like climate change. Yeah, so the argument I hear is that like because like one impediment to like climate change is because like a lot of like right wing like governments like they are climate deniers that they deny climate change. So this is actually like why right-wing governments deny climate change. I think this basically also stems back to the fact that there are like too many ambitious legislation from the left in tackling the climate change. But I guess like the real argument here is that like climate change is not supposed to be associated with the left or the right either, because like climate change is such an issue that is associated with the left, just like immigration perhaps is associated with the right. So like any like populist or third or extremist driving government will try to destroy the left wing like climate achievement of perhaps their previous administrations, because they see like climate change as an inherently like left wing legislation, or that's just the thing. But again, like climate change does not have to be inherently left wing, because like in the 80s and in the 70s, like it was like Reagan who like I think who would do with like the EPA and the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act and all those sort of stuff. So perhaps one way for us to like have more consistent progress in terms of dealing with climate change is perhaps to depoliticize this whole episode and this whole issue to make it perhaps acceptable to both like left-wing government officials and those from the right wing as well.
yeah. Of course, I do agree that one reason why right-wing governments generally don't like climate change is because it's seen as a left-wing issue. But in reality, it should be and here I will be using some uh legal terminology.
Mhm,
Um, I think the word is a peremptory norm, which basically means a universal norm or principle that is agreed upon by all countries. Things like
mhm,
self-determination is. Yeah, totally agree with that. Um, it shouldn't be, a left wing or right wing issue. It should be a human issue. And oh, furthering the previous point on advocacy, um, I think, yeah. So just to further that point on advocacy, I personally think a very um, effective effective method of advocacy. Now that I think about it, is really making um, for example, in this case, the effects of climate change visible. For example, documentaries on this topic, they may be able to really increase awareness because, people will be able to see with their own two eyes, the damage that it is causing people around the world and especially people in low-lying areas. And I think that's, a pretty important part of politics and social sciences in general. It's to see the people behind the policies and the families and communities that they may represent. So I think that's an important part of advocacy. Hmm.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I agree. Maybe social media is also a good idea because
Yeah, maybe.
it is a tech. So
Yeah, yeah, maybe it can, you know, get to more people around the world.
mhm.
Hmm.
Especially the youth.
Yeah.
Okay. So we should move on, right?
Was on the dialogue and the communication that I believe is so important for the world moving forward, or perhaps in our case, the lack thereof. And this is because, while of course it's important for current leaders and the current generation to have dialogue, perhaps it is more important for the future and it brings more hope for the future for there to be sufficient dialogue and communication and good friendly relationships between the future generations. This is especially important, I believe, and it's especially important that we start early because younger generations still do not have preconceptions of all of the other people around the world. And as a result, it's important for them to see each other as friends, or at least as fellow human beings, before the current society comes along and pushes down some of the various prejudices that the previous generations had. Now, this is very like what happened in the 39 Clues, if anyone here has read that. If not, that was a poor analogy. But the point I'm trying to make is, when we look around us, and when we look at people around us, when we look at politicians around us, how many of them speak about other countries, or and sometimes in very demonizing language, without ever have talked to anybody from another country, or ever have been to any other country, or that country that they are specifically talking about? Are those really the people we want making our policy decisions? I don't really think so. And so I think it's important for us to really attach great importance to the dialogue and communication between future generations. And of course, people are going to say that youth empowerment is a dumb idea because young people.
Maybe we should first talk as a communication part. Yeah, so you mentioned that young people should communicate with those from perhaps different culture and countries a bit more because they have less preconception about each other. Yeah, so I just want to say, I think that is also a very privileged statement of you to say because
But yeah, I do agree that it seems kind of privileged. But going back to the point I previously made, I think this is where really the facilitating function of international organizations can come in. I think this is really a place where they can facilitate things, for example, through
Mhm.
um, exchange programs, maybe scholarship programs
I
that
agree.
do exist. I think already. I think there are many UN fellowships and internships, and you know it'd be great if they could start at earlier ages, maybe reach more countries, because I really do think that communication is important because in many places nowadays, the youth really are in many cases, they grow up with these prejudices that are in many cases unfound. They may connect one country with, bad, another country with good. And this is, I think, prevalent and existent all around the world. Um, so yeah, I mean, it is true that so I do really believe that it is important because once you really get to know people from other countries, you often find out that they aren't that as bad as media may portray them, and they're in many cases very interesting. You can become great
I
friends,
agree. Yeah.
and I mean, so yeah, I mean, yeah, of course, you know, summer camps, for example, at certain universities can be very
Mhm.
expensive, but I mean, it's certainly, I think, but I mean, I think again, this is where perhaps international organizations can come in and really facilitate this through the UN, through UNICEF, make these exchanges and interactions more affordable, and
Mhm.
because I do really think they are important for the future.
Yeah, yeah. I think that sounds much more reasonable.
Yeah, my initial idea was not expensive summer programs. That was not
Okay.
my initial idea.
Okay, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think that yeah, equitable access is I would say an important component if we were to have those conversations abroad and among like different countries. And I do think like probably the UN is currently having a lot of those internships and those exchange programs, but I think they are uh in China, they are either targeted towards university students or those in public schools. And as I have kind of like researched this a bit previously, so yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, certainly I think yeah, this is a good example of how international organizations can act as facilitators for the common good. Also, I think with the internet and all this technology, um, it should it should certainly make things also more accessible because you can also have whether it's classes or programs online, right? Which make things more accessible. Um, at least in terms of like transportation and all that. Um, and unless you're taking, again, expensive summer courses, I think online communication can certainly be um, relatively cheaper and more
Yeah,
affordable
yeah.
for all.
Yeah, but yeah, my point like is that online like communication could still be some sort of barrier for some
Oh yeah, of course.
where internet isn't as fast as we have here in
Yeah,
Shanghai. So
that's true.
um perhaps for example in Suzhou the internet might not be as good.
No, that's not true. But I mean, yeah, certainly that internet is also a problem in certain areas. But at least. And I mean, solving internet access is another issue, which also obviously also needs to be solved. But in regions where there already is internet, for example, in Suzhou, I'm sure communication initiatives can be made with countries abroad.
Okay, so we should move on, right?
Mm. Are always too ideal, but I think it's important to have some idealism in the world today. And the third point I would like to make is on guiding principles and guiding values. A very wise person once said, "We live in a very complex world." While that goes without saying, it's true. Using the topic that we have today, the world order, it's a very small topic, yet there are so many questions you can ask. For example, what is the essence of our order? Is it unipolar, bipolar, multipolar? Has it ever been multipolar? Has it ever been unipolar? Has there ever been a world order? There are so many questions, even regarding this one small topic. That's why I believe that to navigate this very complicated world, it's important for us to have guiding principles and values. And on the international stage, that would mean the select few that are agreed upon worldwide, including the need for peace, the need for development, and also the need for human rights, and apply them to our daily lives, to international cooperation, and also domestic governance. You may be wondering, how can we apply these things to our daily lives? Well, I would say through advocacy, through hard work, and most importantly, through the simple act of holding these values dear. In fact,
Yes. So let's stop here. So you mentioned the importance of guiding principles. That is, and I think you've also like briefly touched upon the idea of guiding principles previously in our discussions. And
mm,
so what you're saying that we should only have those guiding principles, but not any like concrete policy rules for those international institutions in order
um,
to like somehow enhance global cooperation. And yeah, but first, I kind of want to start with the part about your idea on the polarity of the world order. So maybe you could elaborate on that first,
oh
and
yeah,
we will delve into guiding principle stuff. Yeah.
yeah. The world order is basically different schools have different ideas on how many the polarity of our world and when or where when it transforms or transitions from unipolar, for example, to multipolar. For example, I think again the School of Offensive Realism, led by John J. Mearsheimer, Professor John J. Mearsheimer, he believes that the world was a unipolar world from the end of the Cold War to I think 2014, around 2014, um, where the
After
world became
which.
I think I'm not sure why he says 2014. I think it was Crimea, but
Uh-huh.
anyway, and also China's growing strength. So he thinks it's a multipolar world at that point with three powers. But I think you would talk to many around the world who think there's only two. And I don't
Hmm.
think many scholars really put Russia into that list.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
I get it.
yeah, so I mean, it's really just a very fluid situation, a very fluid definition. And it's just, I mean, why I talked about the polarity of the world, it wasn't to use the word polarity or polar, three times in two sentences. It was because I wanted to illustrate, the world is a very complicated world, and
Hmm.
oftentimes it's very difficult to work out the details. Whether it's as individuals or as scholars or as institutions. And so I think particularly for individuals, it's important to have guiding principles to guide us through the complicated world that we live in. It's impossible to prepare for every contingency. You have to
Yeah.
sometimes, just come up with things, come up to things when they come to you, solve things when they come to you. Um, and yeah, that was basically my idea. And I think in general, um, it's also true at the global stage. And I think it's certainly more important to stay true to these global principles that are agreed upon, the very few ones that are agreed upon worldwide, rather than delving into the intricacies of, you know, international regulations and stuff like that. But then again, I do still think it is important to have international uh, rules and laws that do regulate certain things, but perhaps not that much, like not
Hmm.
excessively. But I do think, of course, you can't just have a few principles say I want development and that's it. No, I don't think that works. But
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
you still have to have certain rules and maybe regulations, but just not too much of it. And I think there's a little too much of that on the world stage today.
Yeah, yeah, I do hear the argument here because like if you have so much regulations, then basically none of them works. Why don't we just like maybe have less of them, even though it might still not work? So I definitely uh believe that is true. But in terms of guiding principles, I do think like those UNs and WTOs, yeah, for WTOs, I think it was in our econ PPTs that it do have guiding principles. So what you mean is that they should perhaps enhance their guiding principles or something like that. Like the UN also
No,
has the guiding principles, right?
yeah, I think the point I just made wasn't that good, but I think what I wanted to say is that the most important thing is to stay true to these guiding principles. Um, again, the very few that are agreed upon worldwide, because they are universal principles and values. Um, yeah, that's the point I was trying to make. And what I said a few sentences ago is that staying true to these guiding principles takes precedence over um, probably honestly anything else. Mm.
Yeah. I do think that staying true to guiding principles is important, but it could be also demanding. You see, like if like every nation say choose to the guiding principle that they should follow international laws, perhaps now the problem will be solved, right? So I think the
I
role,
mean, if every country follows international law willingly, then I mean, if international law is written in a good way, then the world should be a perfect world, shouldn't it?
yeah, maybe not
Yeah,
because the rules can be biased. So.
yeah, but I mean, I think generally international law is written in a at least like the guiding principles are written in a pretty good manner. For example, the preamble of the UN Charter is written quite well, I would say.
Um, I haven't read on the UN Charter, so I will not comment on that.
Okay. The preamble, I've only read the preamble, so
Mhm.
I only read the preamble recently, so I know what. So I can't talk about the other parts of the chart.
Okay, so we should move on. It's probably the last part of the speech, right?
Yeah, it's my conclusion or my ending.
Okay.
I may sort of digress. I think having guiding principles and values is also the way that we should navigate the world as individuals. But that's the advice of a not so successful high school student, so make of it what you will. As I wrap up this speech, I would like to quote another very wise person who once said, "One should be a great realist in the now and a great optimist in the future." Now that's an ideal worth sharing. I'd like to end with two brief notes on why I think we should be an optimist in the future. This is the prisoner's dilemma. It's everyone's introduction to models in international relations, and also economics. In the short run, when there is one, two, or any finite number of interactions, it is rational to defect, to throw your friend under the bus. But in the long run, when there are infinite interactions, it becomes rational and sometimes is very rational to cooperate. Luckily for us, we're all stuck here, at least for the time being, and we have repeated, if not infinite, interactions. So there's a strong rational argument that we should cooperate going forward. This is a college application essay. Now, it's not mine, but it's a very good one. The author talks about a 175-mile bike ride that members of their community embark on each year to raise funds for a very serious disease. And also, their community's response to Hurricane Ike, how they all came together and helped each other. She ended with, "I believe in the power of people because I have seen them at their finest." I think we all have experiences that can corroborate that. So eventually, whether because of our rationality or our goodness, both of which we do possess, hopefully, I think that we will come around, cooperate, find our way forward, and if called upon, leave a better world order and a better world behind. Thank you.
Okay, so that's the end of the speech. Yeah, so I do think the two analogies at the end are quite solid. Yeah, and
Yeah, I think I was generally happy with them, and I think they did convey what I wanted to convey, which is basically, I think because of rationality and goodness, I think we will eventually do what's right for humanity. I think generally most of the ideas in this speech I agree with. I think perhaps with the sole exception of the structural one, that one, after all, I didn't come up with it myself, so I don't feel that strongly about it. But everything else, I generally do agree with, and I think that
Mhm.
the speech could have been very well delivered. It wasn't, but the ideas were quite decent, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I think like holistically, it's um quite coherent and consistent. So yeah, I think that's all.
Yeah, I think it was a very a TEDx-esque ending.
Mhm.
It was very
Yeah.
upbeat, and it seemed very logical why I was upbeat.
Also, any final remarks?
Yeah, I mean, the speech, it was I prepared it and I delivered it during a pretty intense part of DP1.
Yeah,
I
of
think many
your high
people
school
asked me,
life. Yeah,
what?
of your high school life, I mean.
Yeah, my high school life. And I think many people ask me, do you really have the time to, prepare such a speech and deliver it when you have such a tense schedule? And yeah,
Mhm.
I certainly think that those 2 months with, academics and also preparing for the speech and also preparing for, the Mind Sports Week chess tournament at school, it was a very busy few months. But yeah, I think the TED Talk was certainly a good experience.
Mhm.
My logic behind giving this talk at the time was basically, you know, um, one, I wanted to uh, do some meaningful things in high school. I could look back upon it and say, oh, I delivered a TED Talk. And the second thing is, TED Talks, I've listened to them from a very young time and a very, very young age. And, I've always thought of them to be really very cool things. And I think when you're out, when you, for example, go to college and you enter society, you have to be pretty distinguished to give a TED talk. But in high
Yeah,
school, you just have to sign up to give a TED talk.
that's true.
So I thought it was a pretty good chance, and I also had a somewhat decent idea, I would say, um, with the world order. I think my main idea was actually on hypocrisy in the world order because I had just read a very good article, uh, again by Professor Spector. It was a very good article on hypocrisy in the world order, and I wanted to talk about it. And yeah, I think in general it was a pretty good experience, even though I was pretty nervous backstage. It was a lot of preparing, and it didn't even go that well. But I still think looking back on it, it was a pretty good experience, and I was pretty happy with the speech and the whole experience as a whole.
Yeah, yeah. Just out of curiosity, like how long did you spend like for the speech, like preparing for it and auditioning like in total?
Yeah, I don't really want to talk about the audition part. We'll talk about that in private.
Hmm.
But the preparing part, basically, I can't really recall when the audition came out, when this call to sign up came out. But basically, I would say around, I had the idea, but it was pretty busy, I was pretty busy, so I couldn't write it until like I think 2 days before uh, the uh, the ending of the registration. And then I wrote a very poor script in 2 days, the weekend basically, and then um, somehow somehow they said, okay, that's okay, but you have to make the script better. So
Hmm.
before the next deadline, and so I wrote the script 2 days before the next deadline. So that's 4 days, four nights writing the scripts, and then honestly, I can't really recall how much time I spent on it, but I would say
It's considerable
for
amount of time.
yeah, for like around I think 2 weeks, I would read it and try to memorize it
Hmm.
every night. But I ultimately failed. But yeah, I mean, I spent a decent amount of time on it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. True. Um, I
Yeah,
guess
so
that's all. Yeah,
yeah, I guess that's it. It's my first time listening to it in its entirety, and I must
really.
say it's better than I expected. Because
It's also my first time listening entirely because I really don't listen that much when you're actually delivering.
yeah, I thought it would be pretty. I didn't think it was going to be very good, but now I listened to it. Apart from like a few obvious um pauses, I think the rest of it was decently coherent and
I think the
well put.
positive doesn't really matter that much, so I think it's decent.
Oh yeah, that's okay. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Well, episode or 2 episodes on my TED Talk, and we'll
Yeah.
see you next time.
Okay, see you next time. Hopefully soon. Hopefully within a
Yeah, thank you
week.
for listening. Bye.